So I'll move on to the next presentation. Dr. Jaritt Carty is Associate Professor at Concordia University, where I also teach. And Dr. Carty is in the Liberal Arts College at Concordia University. He is currently on sabbatical, which means that he went out of his way not only to speak to us tonight, although he is on sabbatical and away from academic life in that sense, or away from the university in that sense, but also came from Ottawa to be with us. By train and is going back by bus. He's working on a monograph on Luther's political thought during his sabbatical. His anthology titled Divine King, another book, his anthology titled Divine Kingdom, Holy Order, was published this year in 2013. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jaritt Carty.
Good evening, and thanks for having me. Actually, my purpose, my role here tonight, I think, is to give some background on Luther and Luther's political context, and perhaps give some points of comparison that help us think through the current issue at hand, and to see a bit more of that from a Lutheran tradition. Namely on Luther himself. This is, in fact, an area of, well, I don't want to say expertise, because I completely concur with the comment made before about Luther that he wrote a whole lot. I'm not sure that there are many people in the history of the world who wrote as much as Luther. St. Augustine exceeded him, but there are not many who have. So this always means, especially for a relative newcomer like myself, that there's always something he said that I don't know about and somebody else does, and will quote it to me and make me look foolish. But anyway, tonight, Luther and politics and Luther's political context. Well, foremost, when this topic comes up, invariably the idea of the two kingdoms come up. This is something that is closely associated with Luther's thinking, that there are two kingdoms. Lots of references made to this. And often I find that this is not actually quite very well understood in what Luther meant by that. And so what I want to do tonight is to try to hopefully simplify this. But by saying that, this is both simple and complex for Luther. And that's just as much as the Reformation was both simple and complex itself. Now, you all, at least you're all the namesakes of followers of Luther, which, by the way, he wouldn't have liked. But Luther and Reform centers on the gospel and the rediscovery, at least from Luther's perspective, the rediscovery of the gospel and its radical teaching for us, its radical implications for us. That is to say, in particular, salvation by grace alone. And yet at the same time, there's also something not radical about it. And so there's a paradox here, and that is what the two kingdoms are about for Luther. Let me say that for Luther, more than anything else, the Bible was paramount. And that for Luther's understanding of the Bible, that the Bible revealed the gospel. And the gospel is not the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Mark or Luke, but the gospel. The entirety of the Bible was the gospel for Luther. And this gospel is, of course, the salvation brought to us by the death, resurrection of Jesus, and the promise in salvation for us. The Bible didn't just do that, though, for Luther. It also presented law. And that is the things that God commands us to do to live right. And the law not only helped us live, but it also pointed towards the gospel. That is, pointed out our sinfulness and led us to salvation. And so that these were working in tandem with one another. They weren't complete oppositions to one another. In fact, they worked together, law and gospel for Luther. And it is in this distinction of the grand picture of Luther's version of what the Bible revealed, this is where we get the two kingdoms for Luther, and the beginning of the essence of his political ethic, his political teaching. Foremost, and this is where I think a lot of, particularly in academic circles in the last century or two, particularly, by the way, in the aftermath of great German cataclysms in the 20th century, in the First and Second World Wars, the tendency to see the two kingdoms as something political or something philosophical. For Luther, it's pastoral. It was above all pastoral. That is, to reconcile the teaching of Jesus to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile, right? The radical demand of the gospel to give away yourself. And at the same time, how the letter of Paul in Romans, 2 Peter, or 1 Peter, 2nd chapter, tells us that we must obey authority because God puts it there. These things seem to be, at the very least, in tension, if not contradictory, because so often, as it is so often, governments can command unjust things. So how are these two things reconciled? And Luther's solution to this is the two kingdoms. The idea that there are two kingdoms in which we all inhabit. We are, in a sense, subjects of two kingdoms. And this is confusing because Luther is notoriously imprecise about this. He does not always stick to the same terms, and that's why I think if you see this as a pastoral question, then you get to the key of it. How to reconcile what seems to be Jesus in an antinomian, an anti-law kind of way, telling us to rather than an eye for an eye, give over to your enemy, your cloak. Right? That is to say, to transgress the standards of justice that we are used to, even in the laws of Deuteronomy. So, primarily the two kingdoms is pastoral. Now, what did Luther mean by them? Well, that we have inner and outer parts. I'm going to give you more paradoxes because this is what Luther uses. That we are both inner beings and outer beings. And by that he meant we were also spiritual beings and temporal beings. That our inner spiritual being was centered on the gospel. It was governed by the gospel. And our outer being was centered on law, particularly human law as we experience it. And this pertained to property. This pertained to personhood. It pertained to all political matters. It pertained to the raising of children. And that these two things were inescapably part of us. That we were both temporal beings and spiritual beings. We are both, as he says in Christian Liberty, free and subject. Subject to all authority around us, but free in the gospel. And so the two kingdoms is a kind of pastoral advice, foremost. It's a theology to it, there's a philosophy to it, and so forth, but it's primarily pastoral. How do we be Christians in our world? Now, Luther said that the two kingdoms are both divinely instituted. And this is where it can get confusing because Luther at some times, in some places, in fact many places, talks about the kingdom of the devil. Or at the kingdom of the world in a pejorative sense. And this is not to be confused with the two kingdoms. Because for Luther, the two kingdoms have corresponding governments. The spiritual government, which, by the way, is not equivalent to the visible church for Luther. Christ is at its head and is invisible, the spiritual government, governed by the word, by the law. Ministers are ministers to that government, but they are not equal to that government. They're not itself the government. And then the temporal government, which is the visible government that we see and the powers that we encounter. And these were known to us by our laws, by our parents, and that both were godly. Both were given by God. So he sees government as being divine, a divine gift, as much as a gift to us, as free as a gift to us as salvation. So that these two are together equal the kind of way in which God governed the entire world for us. And they worked in tandem. And so it was not, and this is the mistake that we can make in the 20th and 21st century, particularly in the context of rights and in the American context in particular, it's not secular for Luther. Government was not secular. So Luther said, in addition to these political ideas on his two kingdoms, he always insisted that government was a divine gift, worthy of honor. also said that it was biblically based. He also affirmed, and this is often ignored by many, that it was ruled by reason and law, including natural law. And that ultimately government was for love of neighbor. Now, love of neighbor could take the form of being the executioner for Luther. But primarily, this was in much more peaceful modes, the keeping of order, the cultivating of virtues. Now, what I've done here in introducing Luther is perhaps give you something that's pretty far away from our issue here tonight. So I want to wrap up by bringing this back to the particular issue and how this might inform it. And there's something paradoxical here. Again, typical of Luther and Luther studies, we come back to paradoxes, impenetrable paradoxes. The first being that Luther's world and Luther's conceptions of even something like the two kingdoms is something very far from our world. That is, the 16th century was very low on what we might call and label toleration. In fact, had virtually no concept of this. It was generally assumed in the 16th century, and this is across the board, this is not just Luther, is extremely typical on this point, that civic order can't be pluralistic. That pluralism necessarily means, and pluralism of religion, pluralism of ideas in general, is generally a problem, leads to civic disorder. And this is a massive assumption in the 16th century. It only begins to be unlearned that this is not necessarily the way, that this is an assumption in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War in the following century, in which confessions could seem to be lived together in cities like Augsburg. If we look to Luther on Jews and Muslims, whom seem to be, of course, in our day and age in this topic, to be the sufferers, would be the sufferers of this current bill. Luther, again, not much of an example here. That is, the myth of the Jew for Luther is one that is necessarily one of undermining the civic order. And of course, we don't follow Luther on this. But there's another side in which Luther's thinking on the two kingdoms, I think, is close to our context, or should be perhaps close to our context in how we think about the current issue. And that is, how do we live the gospel and live seeing that the order of things, the temporal order of things, is a gift of God? So on the one side, in satisfying the gospel, the spiritual government, we need to witness, be witnesses of Christ, right? Evangelize, and so forth, to live the command of Christ, to turn the other cheek, and so forth. But then on the other side of the two kingdoms, if we're following Luther, we look upon government as being a gift, a divine gift, and one that's ultimately for the love of neighbor. How do we see then the current issue? And I'll leave that with you. I don't want to go on about my own opinions about this particular, about the particular issue for us at the moment. We can go into this later. But if we follow Luther on the gift of temporal government, I think we come to see then that makes certain demands on limits on where that government goes and what that government does, particularly if our concern is love of neighbor. And that may be the way in which Luther and Luther's two kingdoms continue to be relevant. Not so much on Luther's two kingdoms as being a separation of church and state, but seeing God in both, as Luther did. Thank you.